Good day, and thank you for joining the French Development Agency Research Conversation webinar series. I am Cecilia Poggi, Research Officer for Social Protection at the AFD Research Department in Paris, and I welcome you today to this webinar titled Digital Labor Platforms, What Challenges and Opportunities for Argentina? Over the next hour and a half, we will have the pleasure to engage with a series of experts presenting the latest research around the topic of digital labor platforms, discussing on its functioning and proposing some evidence on the experience that workers make using these platforms. Moving to the content of today's research conversation, let's make a round of introduction with our panelists. So to kick off the understanding around the topic of digital labor platform, we have the honor of having Dr. Uma Rani, senior economist from the research department at ILO. Hi, Ruma. That will propose an introduction on the type of platform jobs that are present out there, and also about the business models surrounding platforms. Our presentation will draw on the ILO 2021 World and Economic Social Outlook report, as well as some ongoing research. Then the conversation will dig deeper into the case of Argentina. And we will be presenting the results from a research collaboration between the AFD Research Department and the Universidad Nacional General Sarmiento, UNGS, that ran over the last 2 years. This partnership has just published 5 working papers, of which today we will hear a taster of 4 ongoing research projects inspecting how worker condition fares using different types of digital labor platform in the context of Buenos Aires metropolitan area. Today, we will have a quick introduction on the primary data collected and the methodologies of this research partnership that will be run through by Dr. Sonia Filippetto. Hi, Sonia. Thank you for joining. And then Dr. Martin Trombetta will look at the issue of registration from the point of view of diverse business models. Hi, Martin. The presentation then will follow with a further and bigger, wider understanding of the diversity among digital labor platform, by which we will analyze the case of domestic workers, and particularly look at the case of domestic service platforms with Professor Francisca Pereira, who is also coordinator of the AFD UNGS Research Partnership. Hi, Francisca. Thank you for being here. And following, we will look closely at the challenges and opportunities that platforms provide in terms of gender equity, by having a presentation by Dr. Ariela Micha, that I salute, on a recent paper from this collaboration. And lastly, I welcome Professor Lorena Poblete, who will cover on some of the challenges that exist around the regulation in the delivery sector in Argentina. So the last 20 to 30 minutes or so of this webinar will be also dedicated to a Q&A session. So I take the chance of this introduction for those who are joining us live today to please note that on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a chat with a dedicated question box where to write questions throughout the webinar. You're welcome to write questions in either English, Spanish, or French, and also vote for a question that is already being asked in this question box. The panelists will then respond at the end of the session of the Q&A part in English. So let's move on to the presentation, and let me pass our mic to our speakers. So I now welcome Uma to take the lead and joining us to start our presentation. Uma, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cecilia, for having me here, and also for the opportunity for the ILO to come and present at this very important meeting. I'm very thrilled to see so many presentations coming up after me, and I'm sure I'll have a lot of things to learn as I hear from all of them. So what I'm going to do today, briefly, is talk about the report, part of the report, which is quite comprehensive, and I'm going to just touch on the platform business model so as to set the scene with regard to what is going to actually come about. So one of the headline figures that this report goes about providing is a fivefold increase in the number of digital labor platforms, just looking at the online web-based taxi and delivery sector. And it also shows that how they are very much concentrated in some parts of the world, that is the United States, India, and United Kingdom. Now, the rise of these digital labor platforms has largely happened because of the availability of technological innovations like cloud computing and cloud infrastructure, and the use of big data and algorithms. Now, one thing that is very important for us to understand is that user data has actually emerged as one of the most strategic economic resources for platforms, largely because of the ability to collect and utilize this massive amounts of data, provides a basis not only to develop new products and services, but also helps in improving algorithms for improving efficiency and productivity. And I guess this is probably the breaking point and the emergence of what we see as the algorithmic panopticon, because data has been collected in the past, but the way it is collected now and the way it is utilized now, I think that's what is very important. And the user data is also key, not only for the development of the machine learning algorithms and the algorithmic management practices, which are used not only in digital labor platforms, but what we are increasingly seeing is that this is being utilized in traditional workplaces. We are doing some extensive research in some of the sectors in the healthcare and retail, where you find that these models are penetrating into many of these workplaces. Now, much of these developments actually would not happen if there was not venture capital funds available. And we see that this is extensively made available, particularly in certain sectors such as taxi. And also, as we saw earlier, there's a sort of a digital divide that exists where a lot of these investment goes to certain parts, largely the United States, some countries in Asia and Europe. Now, the result of all of this has been innovative ways of working and flexibility for both workers and businesses. And we see that this has become increasingly relevant since the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think we have to be assertive and we have to look for solutions, because this is going to increase at a much rapid pace than it did before. Now, we have talked about some of the online web-based platforms, taxi and delivery, but what we are seeing is that platforms are penetrating across a whole range of sectors like healthcare, medical consultation, domestic workers, education, tutor platforms. We'll hear a bit about domestic workers as we go about later in our discussion. But we also see that they are getting into certain traditional sectors such as agriculture, manufacturing, and a whole range of consultancy services that are growing. And you also see the emergence of business to consumers and business to business platforms. This is happening in, again, agriculture, manufacturing, but in a big, big way in wholesale and retail e-commerce platforms. So, they are penetrating across a range of sectors within the economy. So that's why it becomes very important for us to focus on these platforms. Now, before I get into some of the opportunities and challenges that I do want to talk about before I hand over to my colleagues from the research institutions, I want to touch upon two important aspects. One is the features of the platform business model, because I think this is fundamental for us to understand as they are transforming the world of work in a number of ways. Now, the first way they go about doing is through the algorithmic management practices of allocation of work, evaluation, monitoring, and how reward is done. And also, they're disciplined and you can be deactivated. So the dismissal happens also in a very automatic way. Now, this mode of management is a fundamental departure from the traditional human resource management practices, and data is central into the entire operations. The second fundamental change that it is bringing about is the way the work is organized and the way work processes are organized, because what it is doing is it is shifting the responsibility of investing in capital assets or the operational costs whether you're talking about a taxi driver trying to maintain or a freelance worker working from home, having to have his or her own computer, place to stay, as well as internet and other charges, they're being shifted from companies onto the workers, which makes platforms very asset-light. Now, what does that mean? That means that if a platform cannot function or it is having a lot of losses, it's very easy for them to shut it down and go away. Whereas the entire burden of risk and other responsibilities fall onto the workers who have to actually absorb much of these risks. The third, which is very fundamental for us from the ILO's viewpoint, is that how platforms have created the dual labor market. Now, let me take a step back and say duality is not new for many of us in the developing world, in the sense we have a huge informal labor markets. Again, duality is not new in the sense that since the liberal regimes that we have seen since the mid-80s, you find that increasingly in firms, you have a lot of non-standard or informal types of arrangements that are coming in, but the proportions are very small. But what is interesting with this platform economy, what you see in the right-hand side of my slide is the duality takes a much more perverse and a different wavelength, in the sense that you have a very small core workforce, which is in blue, and who mediate these large workers. So you have firms which have 50 co-workers, and they actually mediate 2.5 million workers. I think that's a problematic for us. And the workers in the first category, who are the core workforce, actually have all the labor and social protection benefits, while the others are often characterized as independent contractors or self-employed workers. As a result, they do not have an employment relationship, and they do not have any of the social or labor protection benefits that normally work would bring out, which is for us quite problematic. Now, in our report, we go about looking at a diverse set of platforms, like, you look at freelance platforms, contest-based platforms, innovation or competitive programming platforms, and microtask platforms when you look at the cloud work. And at the location base, we only look at taxi and delivery across a whole range of countries in the developing world. But one thing that we see is that despite the variety of platforms that are there, the business model actually has some very common elements. Now, first, as I mentioned before, they rely on algorithmic management practices for recruitment and matching of workers with clients. And one of the things that they take into consideration is the ratings of the worker. And that includes a whole range of indicators that I've sort of listed there. But what's interesting within that process is that while you have certain sets of indicators that are defined, there might be a number of other indicators that can be brought into the picture, like on freelance platforms. It's very interesting that you have all the client reviews, worker profiles, project histories, and what the rate is proposed by the worker included. But what is often not known is that on some platforms, if a worker has a subscription plan, or if they have paid for certain bids or connects or done some other paid services, then there is a chance that your profile would come up to the top. So it basically questions the entire process of which the ratings is done and how the matching process also happens. But what's very interesting to observe in this entire context is that they not only shift the cost of the intermediation from the platform to the worker, because it's very easier then for the platform to do the intermediation and also to attract clients within the whole process. So, you see systematic shifts in a number of costs to the workers. Now, the second thing, which is very fundamental, is that the revenue strategy of many of these platforms. Now, as a result of these different types of fees, you have revenue being generated by the platforms. Now, this is again a fundamental departure from the earlier models of how a firm operates, but it's quite interesting to see that on some of the platforms, you find that 62% of the revenues are actually collected by charging different types of fees to the workers. Now, this practice of charging fees is actually quite contrary to some of the international labor standards we have, such as the ILO Protection of Wage Convention or the Private Employment Agencies Convention, which very clearly prohibit actually agencies, employers, and intermediaries from charging fees. Now, the third aspect, which is very important, is that platforms try to develop the network effects, which is basically increasing the number of workers and clients, which is both the workers and the clients as users. And they also use that as a mechanism to discipline worker by offering a number of incentives and rewards. Now, the incentives and rewards are not given to all workers. They are used to discipline them, but at the same time, they're used to attract both sides of the parties within it. And often these are funded by the venture capital funding. So this has huge repercussions on the workers' continuity of work onto the platforms, and also with regard to the kind of earnings that they can actually have. Because, for instance, if you take the case of taxi platform, to be able to get these rewards and incentives, you need to have a very high rating. You should not have canceled the ride ever. And you should be able to be monitored and controlled in a systematic manner throughout without having had any objection. Now, if you do all of it, there are chances that you can get you might be qualified for bonuses. But qualifying for bonuses does not mean that automatically you might get the reward, because we have also seen that taxi drivers work very long hours trying to meet their targets. And when they come close to meeting their targets, the algorithm does not actually allow them to meet the final target. So, there's a very clear human intervention and automation that actually happens within the whole process. And as a result, there is a penalization on the taxi driver. The other important point here would be that ratings and reputations have become very central for workers' access to work, and it's a very important form of performance evaluation. And often this performance evaluation is actually externalized, in the sense that it is either the customers or the clients or sometimes the crowd on the platforms who actually evaluates these workers. And as mentioned earlier, platforms also rely on a number of other digital monitoring tools and the GPS, and they actually record everything that is being done in a systematic way, which has an impact on the ratings and workers' further access to work. For instance, on taxi or delivery platforms, if a worker or a taxi driver or rider declines a ride, it has repercussions immediately on the ratings. And often the workers might not get work for a couple of hours, for days, or sometimes they can be completely deactivated from the platforms. And if that's the only source of income that a worker has, then they have to either get back to the traditional labor market or find some other platform to actually build their expertise. Finally, what I would like to highlight here is that the working conditions of these workers are regulated by the terms of service agreement of the platforms, which determines all the workplace protections and entitlement. Now, these rules of the platform governance are unilaterally determined by platforms themselves with regard to whether it is the exclusivity clauses, the deactivation of accounts, dispute resolution, without having any sort of an engagement with the social partners, that is the workers, or with the governments. Now, one final point that I'd like to raise, which often comes in discussions when I'm there, this notion that platform is creating new employment opportunities. I'd like to just say that let's remember that platform is not actually creating new employment opportunities. It is just a technology that is used to mediate work or outsource work, whether it is on online labor platforms or on location-based platforms. Now, such a business model has quite a lot of implications for the workers. And based on the survey that we have done of about 12,000 workers in 100 countries on all these platforms, we do find that workers across all age groups have access to work on these platforms, often that they are highly educated, especially in developing countries. We also see that women can participate on these platforms and they get that flexibility to be able to handle both household as well as work. And this is much more so on online than in taxi or delivery that we have seen. And it also provides opportunities for persons with disabilities and migrants. However, there are huge challenges that exist, which needs to be addressed. And I think we'll hear quite a bit from other presenters today. One is with regard to the earnings, which is often very low. There's also disparity among workers across gender and within a developing context, where on freelance platforms, workers from developing countries who are residing there earn 60% less than those residing in developed countries. There's lack of social protection for most of the workers, and where there exists, it's either from other work or from their other family members. Often, the low earnings and low social protection leads to long working hours, having an impact on the work-life balance. The whole issues around occupational safety and health, especially for workers on taxi and delivery platforms, largely because of the algorithmic management mechanisms that are used. And you see that these practices further precarize workers, and it's much more easy to dismiss them. And the final point I'd like to make is that all of this talk about employment opportunities, what you see, irrespective of the platforms, is a huge skills mismatch and underutilization of skills across all the platforms, which basically begs a very fundamental development question as to what needs to be done to ensure that workers' skills can be utilized in a much better way. Thank you very much for listening, and I pass on the floor to Sonia.
Hello. Okay, well, I'm going to present, thank you, Cecilia, first for your presentation. I'm going to present the methodology of this work. We follow a quality-quantitative approach to study 4 cases for Argentina. These are private passenger transportation, where the platform was Uber, delivery. We studied the platforms Rappi, Globo, Pedidos Ya, and Uber Eats. And for domestic service, the platform was Solvers, and the home repair sector was Home Solution. The study included these thematic blocks, which were social demographic characteristics, labor trajectories, working conditions in the platform, work schedules, earnings and labor-related expenses, access to social protection, and impact of the pandemic on these activities. If you... the qualitative data consisted mainly to a series of 80 semi-structured interviews carried out between June and July. In 2020, they included 20 interviews per occupation under study. The data collected had to do with issues such as previous labor trajectories, motivations to join the platform, general working conditions, access to social protection, as I mentioned previously. Since the data was collected among Argentine's lockdown, the impact of the COVID the crisis on these workers was also a topic of inquiry. The quantitative fieldwork consisted of a survey of 1,500 cases carried out mostly between the second half of 2020, and for Solvers, Home Solution, and Uber, 300 cases were assigned per platform. In the case of delivery, we resorted to a cooperation agreement with the local International Labour Office, and we used first a survey of 300 cases carried out in July in 2019 by ILO, or the International Labour Office, and then an update of the previous survey in July 2020 with 150 cases also conducted by the International Labour Office. And in order to collect on the information on the impact of the pandemic, wherever possible.
We may have lost connection with Sonia. Let's see if she's able to get back to us. Otherwise, Francisca, do you want to finish?
Sure. It's a very short part that she's missing here. The only thing to add here is that because we want to assess the impact of this platform labor on women, we included an intentional quota of 300 women for Uber and delivery, 150 cases for each occupation, in order to have something to say, which is enough number of cases for women. So that's pretty much about the methodological part. And now we leave you with Martin Trombetta.
Sure, here I am. So I'm going to discuss the issue of formalization in platform-based work. So we're going to deal with how these labor transitions for these particular workers may or may not entail a process of formalization. That is, if we're finding that platform-based work promotes in some particular way or another formal work in a region and in a country in particular that features pervasive informality. So, as Uma was saying before, we are finding in Argentina a very important process of platform-based work that has grown a lot in the past few years, particularly in the past few years. And many of these incoming platforms are dealing with sectors, or maybe rather economic activities, where informality is a very, very important problem. So this has drawn the attention of an incipient but still quite large body of scientific literature that addresses this potential formalization effect. That is, are these platforms promoting a better type of labor from the point of view of access to social security benefits? So we have formulated three main research questions, or three types, say, of research questions. The first one being, can these platforms or this platform-based work help promote registered labor in context of extended informality? The second, to what extent do the transitions we find show a process of formalization, precarization, or maybe just continuity, maybe the same, the permanence in the previous situation? And how does this phenomenon vary from one platform to the other? And finally, what does this formalization actually imply for workers, and how do workers perceive it? Are they happy about it? Do they understand the way, the process the same way we do? We believe this is interesting. So I'm just going to show you some of the main conclusions, and of course, you are very much welcome to read the paper and send us your comments. So let's start with Uber. In Uber, we find that 62% of workers have undergone a process of formalization, while only 23% have suffered from precarization. We understand this as a result mainly, or at least in part, of the fact that the private passenger transportation sector in Argentina is highly unionized. So this implies some strong pressures on the company to comply with at least some of the regulations. But I have to stress some of the regulations, because Uber is not actually hiring these drivers as traditionally formal employees, so to speak. What Uber is doing is asking, or requiring, better still, workers to register by themselves on a local tax regime called monotributo. What monotributo does is ask people to pay a tax and then provides them with access to some, say, very elementary social security service. So these workers are formal in the sense that they have access to social security, but in a very limited way compared to traditional labor contracts, which offer a much broader social security net. Most workers in Uber come from unemployment, but before being unemployed, they have a history of traditionally formal labor contracts. So most of them see their current situation in Uber as a setback from that history, because they realize they don't have access to the same social security benefits they once had when they were formally employed. Then we have Home Solution. Situation here is entirely different. Almost half workers in Home Solution show continuity. They are in very much the same situation they were before entering the platform when it comes to formality. And 30% of them have been precarized in the process. This is a consequence of the fact that Home Solution works very differently from Uber. Home Solution is not actually creating jobs like long-term positions. Actually, what the platform is doing is connecting home repair workers with potential clients. So there is no job, no actual job created here. Therefore, the platform does not promote registration. It does not require anyone to register by themselves or to register some other person in any way. And this leads to traditional informal arrangements, which are the norm in the sector, to perpetuate in the platform work. This creates what we call a continuity effect, which is in the end the result of a combination between the resilience of precarious practice, of precarious traditions in the activity, with the absence of formalization incentives. No one is actually offering anyone specific benefits, specific economic gains from formalization, so we don't find meaningful results there. And finally, we find Solvers. Solvers is also a very different picture, because here only 8% workers are being precarized, and most of them are either in the same situation they were before, or they have undergone a process of formalization. Solvers connects domestic workers with potential employers and promotes the creation of long-term salaried contracts. Not only does it do that, but it also actively promotes formalization. It offers registration. In Argentina, it is the employer who must register the domestic worker, and Solvers offers such registration as a particular service that is advertised to employers. There are also some benefits for the worker if he or she becomes registered. So we might say that this platform is actually working towards formalization. However, despite all these efforts, there's still a limit to this process. There is a ceiling, which is a result of a very, very deeply rooted informal tradition in the sector. Workers in this sector in Argentina are pretty much used to being informal, and employers are usually reluctant to formalizing their domestic workers, so this represents a limit to this process. However, these workers usually come from very, very precarious labor backgrounds, so they very much value this process of formalization when it takes place. They consider it a strong asset on the platform's behalf. So to conclude, and of course I'm summarizing greatly here because the paper is quite long, but to provide some meaningful insights on the conclusion of the research, we find that the formalization effect of platform-based work depends largely on three main features of the specific situation. The first one being the platform's business model. That is it in the interest of the platform to promote or to encourage registration, or does it really not affect the company's economic situation? Secondly, we have the specific labor market conditions for that activity itself and also for the economy in general. The Argentine labor market has suffered greatly in the past few years. Firstly, due to a very big recession in 2018, and then to the negative effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, which were particularly strong in the region and in our country in particular. So this determines what kind of labor transitions we're going to find. Who are the workers entering the platform economy and where do they come from? So that determines whether this entrance represents formalization, precarization, or continuity. And in the end, we have to deal with the particular dynamics, a specific tradition in that occupation per se, whether for that occupation, this type of work represents an enabler or an obstacle to formalization. And then we have the issue of what this process means to workers, how they perceive it, how happy they are about it, and what they find, what they feel they are obtaining from it. There, we believe there are two main issues to deal with. Firstly, there is the type of formalization, of formal insertion the platform is promoting, because evidently workers do not feel the same way about a traditional waged relation, which in Argentina carries great respect and an important social consideration, and that is seen very differently from self-registered self-employment under monotributo or some other particular tax regime, which is considered a very different thing, because it is. And then we have the workers' labor background. Where do they come from? For workers who come from a tradition, from a personal history, rather, of salaried work, self-employment under monotributo is obviously seen as a setback. Whereas if these workers come from a history of informality or labor instability, entrances and exit from an informal labor market, they are more prone to finding this new type of insertion as a positive one. So this is all I have to say.
Thank you. So this presentation will delve deeper into the issue of diversity of business models and in its impact on workers, by analyzing more in depth the case of the Argentinian domestic service platform. And the topic is also important because, as Uma pointed out later, that these type of platforms are growing worldwide and in Latin America too. But in our region, the topic has remained mostly unexplored so far. So Solvers is a platform that was born in 2014. It's the only platform for domestic workers operating in the country. And according to the legislation for this type of work, it places workers in salaried positions, as Martin said. Solvers doesn't charge workers, as many other platforms do. Rather, it charges a fee to employers for each job placement, and it also offers them what is called the Solvers payment system, which is optional, but is aggressively promoted. And this Solvers payment system offers employers basically to disengage from all the hiring procedures for a monthly fee. So the company offers to pay workers' salary each month through an automatic debit from the employer's account. And eventually, if the employer wishes so, the company takes care of all registration procedures of the worker and the monthly social security payments for her. So the company is selling as a product the registration of the worker, and therefore promotes registration, as we will see later on. And the company also provides, as many other platforms of the sector do, a device designed to calculate hours worked, absences, and so on, in order to estimate the final remuneration of each month. So what kind of jobs does this platform create, so to speak? It doesn't create them, but intermediate between. As it tends to happen with this type of platforms, jobs created are of very short working hours. As we can see in the graph, 35% imply only up to 5 weekly hours, compared with the sector as a whole. This number is reduced to 12%. And in overall terms, gigs and part-time jobs prevail. 93% of the jobs in Solvers imply less than 24 weekly hours. Now, in terms of registration, as we can see here, if we consider the registration rates of these part-time jobs, we can see that at the national level, the registration rate is very low, of 16%, and this has to do with the fact that low-hour jobs have proven to be the more resilient to formalization policies. But when we look at this very same type of jobs within Solvers, we see a higher registration rate of 44%. And if the job is paid via the Solvers payment system, as one might expect, the registration rate goes up to 66%. And this has to do with the business model that, as we have seen, self-service related to registering workers. This means, as one of the workers quoted here points out, that the company is constantly advertising the benefits of registration both among employers and workers. However, despite this higher formalization, job stability within the platform is weak. This has to do with what we have called the vulnerability effect of short working hour position. And this simply means that dismissal costs are substantially cheaper than in full-time jobs, so rotation is higher. This can be clearly seen during the most severe part of the pandemic in the graph, where despite the fact that registration did have some protective effect, in the end, job destruction within Solvers was much higher than in the sector in general. And this has to do with this short working hour position. Another dimension that is interesting to look at has to do with the fragmentation of work schedules due to this very prevalence of short working hour positions. Solvers workers, as might be expected, have to deal with more employers on average, 3.3 in contrast with 1.5 for all domestic workers in the country. This situation is experienced dissimilarly by workers. Some of them highlight the benefits of not having to depend on the mood of one single employer, and also they highlight they have more possibilities to adjust their personal schedules, their work schedule with their personal needs, for example, and mainly care responsibilities. But on the other hand, some workers, especially those who depend more heavily on the activity, remark negative aspects like more extended work days because having multiple employers implies more commuting, and also the fact that they have to face multiple negotiations with different employers, which is a problem in the context of highly asymmetrical labor relationships that characterize the domestic service sector. And finally, the scoring mechanisms of the company, although unfair and opaque, as it happens with most platforms, can also be seen as having an ambiguous or low impact on workers. We can see that 47% of all workers surveyed were deactivated at least once. Among them, 60% perceived that this deactivation was unfair because it was due to a dispute with the employer, and they did not have the chance to express their point of view on the situation because the scoring is unidirectional, only employers rate workers. That is why 87% of all surveyed workers consider it would be very important to rate employers back. However, even when the system is highly unfair, unlike what happens in other platforms, deactivation does not imply the straightforward impossibility of working. And this is because salaried jobs obtained through the platform continue to be active. Deactivation only affects the reception of new job offers. To conclude, the impact of this platform is marked by pros, cons, and ambiguities, and this differs from the more straightforward precarization trends that we can observe in the more traditional platforms like taxi and delivery. Undoubtedly, the fact that this platform deals with salaried job positions marks an important difference with traditional platforms that promote the figure of the independent partner or the independent contractor. Although this modality of labor certainly requires regulation in many respects, one important positive aspect to highlight is the achievement of higher registration rates in an occupation marked by informality and higher in contrast with the occupation as a whole. And in this particular point, we find that there are some good practices in this respect that could be replicated by other platforms of the sector or other intermediaries of the sectors like employment agencies. And basically, I'm talking about this idea of selling the registration package and promoting registration, therefore, among employers. But beyond all this, we put the case of solvers on the table to reinforce the idea that we need to continue working on more refined and disaggregated typologies of platform labor, both within and beyond this sector, in order to capture the variety of the phenomenon, something which in turn should serve as an input for the pending task of regulating the growing, dynamic, and diverse world of platform labor. So I leave you now with Ayala.
Thank you, Francisca. Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here presenting our research and our findings. I am going to address gender inequalities in the platform economy, focusing on two occupations, ride-hailing and delivery services in the Buenos Aires metropolitan area. So in terms of the background, despite the growing literature that looks at the expansion of the platform economy and its effects on labor conditions, we find that the analysis of how it affects pre-existing gender inequalities in the labor market is still a phenomenon under study. And this is particularly in the context of developing countries. At the same time, in Argentina, the massive entry of platforms coincided with a severe economic recession that only worsened during the COVID pandemic. And especially, we have to point out that unemployment has affected women more strongly than men. And this has constituted an incentive for many female workers to try their luck in jobs offered by the incoming platforms. So in this context, this study analyzes gender inequalities among platform riders and drivers. It investigates gender gaps in terms of working hours and earnings, and we are also delving into their determinants. And we are paying particular attention to the obstacles faced by women for accessing the more profitable days and time slots. Now, in terms of female presence in these occupations, although these are predominantly male-dominated activities, available local data, and this is in line with what I was saying as a global evidence, available local data indicates that platforms are facilitating female participation in these occupations. Regarding the reasons that bring women into these occupations, in the interviews, female workers emphasize, in the first place, time flexibility, which allows them to combine paid labor with the bulk of care responsibilities socially assigned to them. Secondly, the local labor context also plays an important role, as was stated. The incoming platforms coincided with the severe recession plus the COVID pandemic recession. So this is another important reason that female workers emphasize when describing their process of entering the platforms. Lastly, another issue that emerged in the fieldwork is the impersonal recruiting mechanisms, which tend to help to avoid direct discrimination. As the quota is suggesting, female workers point out that the discrimination they might face in entering this highly masculinized occupation is neutralized or partly neutralized by an entry mechanism that does not require direct interaction and is usually limited to the fulfillment of certain online requirements. When we analyze this, how the economic performance is influenced by the choice of time of service provision across working days, data shows that female workers tend to participate to a lesser extent in working times that are peak in terms of demand, as the graphs are showing, particularly during at night and weekends. According to the qualitative fieldwork, women tend to avoid working at night, first of all because they want to stay at home with their children. This is a reason that came up in our fieldwork. And this also happens during weekends when usually it is more complicated to set care arrangements. Another important reason for these choices is that they feel more vulnerable towards street insecurity, violence, and harassment. And even when women work at night, we found that they try to avoid certain areas perceived as unsafe to a greater extent than men. And also they tend to refuse counsel services to a greater extent than men if they distrust the person requesting. So this leads us to include explanatory variables linked to preference towards days of the week and time slots in order to analyze gender gaps in these two observations. First of all, the analysis reveals that both in the delivery and the Uber samples, there is a significant gender gap in weekly hours worked, while in terms of hourly income, a significant gender gap is only found for the delivery sample. In terms of the determinants for the delivery sector, being a migrant is associated with more hours spent working through the platform, pointing to the significant weight of migrant labor in this profession. And this effect, at the same time, is found both for male and female workers, because this is mainly associated to the vulnerability of recent arrival, which implies greater income pressures. Then, for female riders, a relevant factor explaining longer working hours is if they use a motorcycle for work, as opposite of using a bike. And this factor, as might be expected, is also associated with higher hourly income, both for male and female workers. And it is important to say here that this finding is consistent with one of the gender asymmetries that came up during our research, which is that women usually have more difficulties accessing the most efficient vehicles and generally work using bicycles, while men tend to use motorcycles. Then, having any person who is dependent economically from the worker is another determinant which induces a greater hour engagement of the platform for delivery workers. And this effect we find that is relevant only in the male sample. This is interesting to stress because in the case of women, although having independence may generate a movement towards more working hours, this could be compensated by the fact that these same dependents, which are mostly minor children, generate a demand for care which tends to fall predominantly. Then, in the case of Uber workers, female and male drivers who own their car both tend to work less hours than those who are paying the rental. And this is interesting to note that there are no gender disparities among drivers who enter the platform with their own car. This is a different case than the delivery case, as I was mentioned before, in terms of the access to the productive asset. And as per the effect of having any economically dependent person at home is the same as observed in the case of delivery. On average, being a carer makes the workers work a greater number of hours, and this effect is also driven by the male sample. So, to sum up, our research shows that even if female entry to traditionally male-dominated occupations can be assessed as a positive trend, as it opens new occupational opportunities and facilitates a source of income, it still implies significant gender gaps. In addition, these flexible schedules platforms offer, even if they imply more opportunities for women participation in these occupations, we find that women still adjust their paid labor time according to their socially assigned and male and domestic responsibilities. And in the case of delivery specifically, another factor that influences the economic performance of male and female platform workers is that women do not enjoy the same levels of access to the more efficient vehicles, and this is because men have access to motorcycles to a greater extent than. Finally, an important conclusion is that women experience more restrictions in terms of when and where they can work, mainly due to care responsibilities and also due to safety reasons. And this implies that it affects their ability to take advantage of the more profitable days and time slots, but also, even when women work at night, they tend to earn less as they take the risk for fewer hours and avoid many services in locations with zero emissions. Thank you.
In this paper, the last paper that we'll present today, we focus on the regulation concerning the digital platform, the only case in which there are proposition for a specific regulation. For the other cases studied in this research project, general labor legislations apply. Between 2019 and 2020, 7 draft bills were presented to Congress aiming to establish a more protected labor status to delivery workers that usually work as self-employed workers. Analyzing the proposal included in the draft bills and the position of the riders concerning which would be the best way to regulate this occupation, the paper aims to understand the ways in which the regulations tries to resolve the dilemma around the legal classification of delivery platform workers. This draft bill proposed different legal frameworks. First, to incorporate platform workers into the general employment regime, since the employee status represents the key to access to all labor and social security rights. Second, it is suggested to establish a special labor regime in order to grant delivery platform workers a large part of the right recognized to employees, but also including special protections more adjusted to this occupation. Third, it is provide to independent contractors some protections such as work hazard insurance. And finally, it is proposed a mixed regime including the two labor status. On the one hand, workers who work more than 21 hours per week or work exclusively for one platform are classified as employees. On the other hand, those working less than 21 hours a week are classified as independent contractors. In all cases, the different draft bills seek to resolve the tension between autonomy and protections. A qualitative and quantitative data suggest for platform delivery workers, there are two central issues narrowly related that make this occupation interesting. First, the relative flexible working hours, and second, the possibility of maximizing income by increasing the number of working hours. Most delivery workers interviewed value the fact that they can choose when logging and decide the number of daily working hours. For women, it means the possibility to combine paid work with unpaid care work, particularly caring for children. But also, it allowed them to avoid night shift, which present more risk, such as being assaulted in the street. Flexible hours also allow delivery workers to increase the number of working hours to raise their incomes. According to the workers, to obtain a good income, they need to work about 12 hours, 6 days a week. However, most of delivery workers work 45 weekly hours and Venezuelan migrants 55 hours a week, present to send remittance to their country. The average income of delivery workers in July 2020 almost tripled the value of minimum wage. When we ask them about the possibility to become employees, most of them consider that they will not continue working if they gain the minimum wage. Also, women said that they may not be able to continue working if they have to respect a fixed working time. From the delivery worker's perspective, the ideal situation will be to choose the working time and self-determine the level of income, but having access to protection like work hazard insurance. The workers express their concern about the insecurity in the streets and the lack of social protection from violent robberies and traffic accidents. Indeed, 62% of them work without having any accident insurance. The draft bill presented to the Congress proposed a balance between protections and autonomy by establishing the general regime of working time as a framework, but enabling some derogations. The general regime of working time established a working day of 8 hours with a maximum of 45 weekly hours, with 12 hours of daily rest and 36 continuous weekly rest hours during the weekend. A generalized proposition to protect delivery workers is to define as working time the time of being logged in the platform. That means that the on-call time is considered as working time. Other measures aiming to protect delivery workers are to burn extra hours for employees and to block workers automatically when they accomplish the maximum authorized hours. Aiming to allow flexible working time, the draft bill proposed for independent contractors to extend the daily working time to 12 hours and for employees to extend the daily working time to 9 hours or to allow them to continue working if they have 2 hours break after 8 working hours. In some within draft bills, which propose to keep the independent contractor status, the proposition is to legalize the actual practice. And within the draft bill, which suggests classifying delivery workers as employees, the proposition is to facilitate the extension of working time limits. Concerning the autonomy to choose the shifts, independent workers would be able to choose the working time within the limit established by the platform. And for employees, they will have to have an arrangement with the platform concerning their shifts. Even though the restriction on the number of working hours have a direct impact on the possibilities of maximizing the income that this occupation can generate, the bills presented to the Congress try to maintain the variability of income as an incentive. Regarding independent workers, the bill maintains the actual situation in which delivery workers are paid by the task and receive a bonus for working in particular shifts, night shift with bad weather or moments in which there are a high demand. Concerning employees, the bill established a minimum wage guarantee and the same bonus for working in particular circumstances, especially for those who work more than 30 hours a week. When working on public roads, delivery workers are highly exposed to accidents. That is why protection against accidents represents the main demand for workers in terms of social protections. In response to this claim, draft bill, which proposed to keep independent contractor status, suggests continuing using private accident insurance for this sector, but in some cases, the platform is responsible for the payment of this insurance. In the case of employees, they will be included in the work hazard insurance of the general labor regime. Thus, this draft bill do not propose regulatory innovation, but rather the access to occupational hazard insurance depends on the two pre-existing status. This implies the segmentation of the quality of occupation risk coverage because the employee's insurance includes more protection than the accident insurance for self-employed workers. The consideration of workers' concern regarding a potential regulation of the activity and the analysis of the existing proposal raise a tension that is difficult to resolve. The need for workers to maintain flexible working time in order to maximize incomes constitutes a clear contradiction with labor standards in terms of a balance between work and rest time. Probably the demand regarding access to protection against accident at work is the most permeable to finding solutions. It seems essential to stipulate that the cost of this insurance be absorbed by the companies, since the data make clear that limited capacity of workers themselves to cover this insurance. Undoubtedly, access to social protections constitutes a much larger issue than the one addressed here, circumscribed to work hazard insurance. In this sense, most of the draft bills provide for various measures to extend access to social security benefits, included in the general labor regime. However, the necessary assumption of responsibilities by companies implies an increase in their operating cost. So the question arises as to what extent they would be willing to maintain all the existing riders into their workforce. In labor markets such as Argentina, the problem is particularly relevant given the economic crisis caused by COVID pandemic. The increased participation of local workers in this platform during the last years and the strong presence of recent migrants in this activity make it clear that platform delivery work constitutes a refuge activity. That is probably the reason why the bills presented were not included in the Congress agenda. The definition of regulatory regime capable of framing platform delivery work will be pending until the different actors involved can find a point of articulation between the preservation of both the level of income and job position with an effective access to labor and social security rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorena, and thank you so much to all of the speakers today. The series of presentation has been actually quite wide, presenting a complex scenario. Not only, as Uma said at the beginning of our talk, about all of the different modalities in which platforms can work, but also then the national realities that each country experience and also is trying to deal in the creation of a set of regulations and general frameworks for which to help workers to basically better access, but also get, let's say, a more decent job out of this platform experience. So let me now open the Q&A session. Thank you so much to all of the people joining live and sharing your question. We tried to compile a few of them together to sort of perhaps bring about one question that I could propose to one of your speakers, but then I will be very happy to leave the floor open to all others of you panelists who would like to add further remarks as we go along. So please, panelists, do not hesitate to switch on your mic if you want to complement some of our discussions. So looking here in the chat, let me first start perhaps with Uma. And let me get a question that comes from our chat box, which less or more states, in your presentation, you point out a series of challenges that arise through platform labor. And for instance, we can think of some like the degree of algorithmic management or skilled mismatch, or on the utilizations of skills that you mentioned in your very rich presentation. And so the participant was asking, which of these challenges do you think are more difficult to take through with regulation in developing countries? And if so, why? And I would add also, and which could actually be more easily tackled? What do you think? Give us your take, Uma.
Well, not an easy question to ask. Yes, there are a number of challenges that exist, but I don't believe that none of them are not tackleable. The reason I'm raising is that there are two things that are happening, and I think we need to recognize it and go about. One is to understand how platforms have come into the labor markets of these countries, because they have found a way that, well, there is a lot of unemployment, there is a lot of precarity, there's a lot of informal employment. So let's get in there and actually try to intervene, and then try to talk about employment opportunities or creating formalization. And as you very rightly saw with Martin and other presentations, the formalization that is then talked about is rather at a very, very basic level. So I think that's one issue to be handled, and that can be handled very well, actually. You could, instead of precaritizing workers, use the same technology to actually ensure that the workers are protected, providing decent social protection benefits, ensuring that the workers are registered, and ensuring a clear employment relationship so that the workers can get their benefits. So, all of this is doable. We do know that countries have implemented it. There are countries like Uruguay which have brought it within its tax system and other social security systems to provide it. You also have countries like Estonia which have gone about doing it. And you also have one-to-one exchanges between platform companies and governments which have tried to do it. So to me, all of that is very important, and all of that is it's doable with the technology, whether one is talking about employment status, collective bargaining, talking about adequate social security benefits, or the way dispute resolution process have to be set up and all of it. I think with regard to the prices, it's very interesting, and I think this is something quite important for us to take note of. Now, they are entering sectors where the price of a task or a price of a work was clearly defined. Whether you're talking about domestic workers, whether you're talking about taxi rides, whether you're talking about even a freelancer's job for certain tasks, they are all within occupations defined. Now you're coming with a with a model which says, okay, we are a match workers across the globe with clients across the globe. And that's where you disrupt markets. That's where you disrupt the pricing mechanism. And I think if the platforms have to operate, they have to ensure some of the existing regulations within the economies that are there. And I think this is fundamentally important. Parallel to that discussion, I think it's very important to look at the discussion on how we can generate employment opportunities in the offline labor market. And I think one of the reasons why people are jumping into it is largely because you do not have an employment policy or a strategy that exists in your labor market which can actually absorb many of these workers. So to me, these are two things hand in hand to be done. Nothing is impossible. Everything is doable. We have to really sit down and think about how do we use our educated workforce to bring about a productive transformation in our economy and society. Thank you.
Thank you, Uma. This is not an easy task, and I believe that this is really the beginning of a conversation on this matter. So let me actually follow through with the topic just covered with Uma by asking a question that was raised in the chat to Martin. So given all of the shortcomings about worker registration as self-employed versus something more like a waged employee that you described in your presentation, when higher registration happens, would you say that there are any specific positive aspects to these formalization effects that a worker may benefit to by joining a platform?
I'm sure there are, and I believe Solvers proves that, most of what Uma has just said, the fact that we can use technology to make things better in a nutshell, to find ways to promote formalization strategies that might not be too expensive for employers, might not entail large efforts on behalf of workers, and might end up with a better situation for pretty much everyone involved. The thing is, what I believe our findings show is that that's probably not going to be the case all the time everywhere. That's how I interpret these results. In some cases, due to the particular labor background of these workers, the particular economic nature of the activity that is being provided, the way the platform chooses to design incentive schemes, so to speak, all that is going to establish possibilities and limits. I believe Solvers is proof that this can work in the right direction. I do not I do not believe there is a counterexample, so to speak. You see what I'm saying? I don't believe there is an experience that says, no, wait, this is going to precarize all workers. I don't believe that's going on. Well, what I believe is happening is that labor conditions in Argentina have been harsh the past few years, and some of the time platforms cannot really provide an improvement opportunity for that. I don't believe the platform economy is to blame for the Argentine economy's historic and recent problems. So in the end, what I'm trying to say is, yes, I'm sure this can happen, but this requires an adequate and modern legal structure. This requires work from institutions with the platforms to design the right incentive schemes. And of course, there's going to be a learning process involved.
Thank you so much, Martin. And now, quickly, there was a question about methodology, and as Sonia is not here, I can take the opportunity and reply myself. So the question was saying, how did we find the workers to include in the sample, and did we get through this via platforms or snowballing? So for the first part of the project related to qualitative data collection, we contacted platforms, and we started getting into engagements to find more about the structure of workers via also the platforms, but also via workers themselves by contacting associations and groups of or cooperatives when there were any. But then for the actual data collection, this was done through snowball sampling. Yes, correct. And although it is not simple, because as many of the researchers present here know, these type of platforms tend to not have a representative sampling frame provided by, for instance, National Statistics Office, or it is in some cases very difficult to find them in specific locations. We had to rely upon, let's say, the network component of inspecting via platform networks locally where people were, and particularly by looking at the statistics of how the demographics were looking like of the population. We try in as much as possible to be representative by different age groups and, of course, gender into our analysis. This is one of the reasons why we did have a small quota, or let's say an oversampling put also on identifying female workers on the platform, and particularly active females. So I hope that we replied to this, but if there is any further comment on the methodologies, please do not hesitate to write us in the chat. With respect to further questions on the presentation, I now wanted also to move towards Francisca. And there was a question that was raised about the domestic service platform, stating that in this type of relationship, of this platform relationship, does look like an employer-employee situation. And so the question asks, to what extent do you think that this type of platform can or should be regulated as a platform per se? So do you have any suggestion on that? You're muted. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Yes, we get that question quite often. Solar is indeed closer to the figure of a real or a more authentic intermediary when we compare it with the traditional platforms that we all know, like taxis and delivery. However, it has features of a labor platform, features that Uma pointed out before at the beginning. They have the algorithmic management used to match clients with workers, the algorithmic management for evaluating and monitoring workers, this opaque and unidirectional scoring mechanism, the activations, and so on. So again, in some aspects of its regulation should be related to the figure of an employment agency, that could apply, but others aspects are related to some features proper of platforms. That is, once again, good typology is needed in order to determine the specific regulation challenges posed by each group of platforms, I think. So I don't know if that answered the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francisca. And now let me move to Ariela. There is a question that asks, how do you think that future regulation should tackle the gender inequalities that you describe for Argentina?
Can you hear me? Okay. So thank you for the question. First of all, we think that the preservation of flexible schedules seems a key issue in order to allow women to continue participating in these activities. So this should be considered when we think about the gender-sensitive regulation in Argentina, specifically thinking on this particular situation. Of course, this needs widely exceeds platform labor, but if we are going to create a specific regulation for these platforms, we need to include those considerations. Then, another important issue should be platform policies, like establishing privileges and or penalizations associated with hourly engagement, speed, or job rejections should be reconsidered, because we know from our research that they tend to deepen gender inequalities in terms of hourly earnings. And thirdly, we think that initiatives aiming to reaffirm the safe mobility of women seem fundamentally necessary in order to promote fuller female participation in these occupations. And this has been addressed by platforms. For example, the Uber platform in Argentina has created a new function for the app called Uber Ellas, in Spanish, She Uber in English. And this is a tool in order to allow women to kind of control the service requests from the platform, as they can restrict the requests by saying that they only want to take services from persons registered as women. So this is a tool that they can activate or deactivate at any time, but usually is thought for the nights when women are more prone to feel unsafe, and especially not only because of street insecurity, but also because of violence and harassment from the clients. So even when the platforms take a role and have something to do with this, we also think that this should be a broader public policy agenda against the multiple manifestations of street insecurity which affect women more intensely than men, and restrict their job opportunities and general well-being. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ariela. This was like a very wide question, and I'm sure that there will be plenty of discussions on how to best in different countries include this dimension into future regulation. Lastly, Lore, one question for you coming from the chat. It says, to what extent are the regulation proposals found in Argentina applicable to other countries, like in Latin America, or I would even add in other emerging economies? And maybe we can also add to this question, can you give us some example of some similarities or divergence that you may think of?
Thank you. Concerning the propositions, the bills, we can see that they propose a segmentation between delivery workers concerning the number of hours, the working hours per week. And we can see that there are in the different draft bill this perception in which if there is the case of delivery workers that work like a gig, that make just gig from time to time, but it's not the principal job, they will be accepted to be enrolled as self-employed workers. But in the case of this is a principal job, particularly for workers who work more than 30 hours a week, it must be considered as an employment relationship. This is kind of the model that in different ways the draft will propose, and we can think that it's a model that could be applicable to any Latin American country, because as it was said earlier, that the structure of the labor market with almost half of the population working as informal workers, and also the regulations in the labor regulation, kind of similar regulation, could allow to give it the same responses. And if I have 1 minute to just jump in the question that Francisca answered, because I'm also working that paper. One particularity of the Argentinian law about domestic work is that the definition of domestic worker is a person who works at least 1 hour per week for one employer. And this definition of the scope of the law make possible that every domestic workers could be formalized in an employment relation, direct employment relationship, through the platform, even if the platform do the matching. And this is the regulation established in Argentina. However, when we observe what happened in Brazil, for instance, when the scope of the law don't apply for all domestic workers who work at least 1 hour, and there are this category of domestic workers called diaristas who work less than 8 hours a week for the same employer. In that particular case, we observe that the platform of like solvers are increasing the precariousness of the workers, because they use this loophole in the law, or this particular characteristic in the law, to increase these gig jobs without protections. Even there are many provisions to protect domestic workers in Brazil law, but in Argentina, the platform, they cannot use this escape to promote more precarious worker relationships. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. This is actually super interesting to be able to compare also across national legislations and figure out where there are potential loopholes or also potential challenges that may be faced by national authorities. So, unfortunately, the time is almost time to wrap up. But I wanted to open in a 1 minute, one answer proposal to all of you panelists. A question that, if I may have this honor of asking, is about what do you think could be some upcoming topics that research should actually either further develop or start taking care of in order to answer better to the question of better jobs via a digital labor platform? Can you think of any potential area where more research would be welcome?
You want me to go?
Please.
Yeah. I think I want to answer that question, and if I can take half a minute, I want to talk a bit about policy also, because that's important. I think what I'm hearing today, basically based on the research that is coming on Latin America, is especially, I think Martin did a great job in doing this presentation, as you know, where you are with the whole formality element, and where there's a continuity, where there's precaritizing that is happening. That itself shows that across sectors, experiences are different, but it also brings out another element, which is probably not there, is that while you would have at the international level one Uber model, when it comes down to the country levels, there are different models that are coming up, and that are being adapted depending upon the country, depending upon the region, depending upon the institutions and regulations that are there. I think what we need to do is to have a much better understanding about what are the different models that are there and which are the sectors that they are penetrating, and to actually build up a lot of empirical evidence across different, whether it is on data, whether it is on algorithmic management practices, all of it which have an impact on the working conditions of the workers. And I think this building up, there's a lot more research that needs to be done at that kind of a country level. And the reason I feel that this is very important to do is that as it didn't really come out in the discussion because we got into the regulations about, what can Argentina do and what more needs to be done and what's its applicability. I think there in the question and answers I think it was very interesting to hear about the applicability in other contexts in Latin America and others. But I think one thing we have to recognize is that much of these platforms operate globally today across multiple jurisdictions. And I think it throws open a huge regulatory gap with regard to, if you want to, even if countries have institutions, what kind of laws are really applicable within a context? Is it the country of origin of the platform or where it is operating, or whether it's a client country? And I think that for me is the biggest challenge that I see. I think if I see any challenge at all with platforms, and I think what we do in our report is go about giving this recommendation saying, the way forward is to have an international policy dialogue and coordination. And for me, that can only happen if you have a solid empirical evidence and research actually coming by to see, okay, what can we do and how do we move forward? Thank you.
May I add something?
Please.
Thank you very much, Uma. I totally agree with you. There's much to do here. There's a lot to do here. And one very interesting aspect of the platform economy for us researchers is that it provides new sources of data, because now we don't just have to rely on surveys, which are, of course, super important and very much necessary, but we might be able to exploit the data, the big data generated by these apps in the future. And if we combine that with some clever econometric techniques and the latest findings from the behavior economy, we might be able to understand what incentives work. Let me come back once again to the case of solvers. In Argentina, registering a domestic worker is very, very cheap for an employer, crazy cheap. However, only 25% of employers do it. So there's a problem there, and that I refuse to believe that problem has no possible solution. I think there must be a solution, and maybe platforms like Solvers can, with their rights and wrongs, can provide us insights on how to do things better.
So if I may just also translate this towards even other platforms, you see a room there for having regulatory bodies talking to platforms to try to find joint solutions, right, via the platform. I see. Thank you, Martin. That's a very good insight. Anyone else would like to add, chip into the table to this question? I see Francisca smiling.
No, I think what Uma and Martin brought up is very relevant. I think there's what we need to, of course, in terms of research, there are lots of dimensions that we need to board, but we have our first pending project to regulate delivery workers in the Congress, which is frozen, and I think we need to look at what happened, for example, in Spain, because our project is very similar to what the Spanish government passed for delivery workers. When we have these fears of what happens with the preservation of working positions and what happens with their earning levels, I think we need to look at what is happening worldwide in order to, I think we need to look for comparative research on because our labor market, despite the high levels of informality, when it comes to formal labor, is highly protective and is very standardized. And the new legislation proposes to convert these workers into salaried workers. And I think it will be super interesting to add information on what happens, for example, in countries like Spain, and to think about our context, how this would work. And of course, all the things that have to do with gender. We have a very interesting data showing that women are, as Ari pointed out, the sound was horrible, poor Ari. Women are entering in big proportions in traditionally masculinized occupations like delivery and driving on platforms, and we need to continue thinking about gender-sensitive approaches to think about legislation. And I think our current project, the main project that is waiting in the Congress, does not provide that gender perspective. So we need to insist on that respect. So that's it from me.
Thank you so much. This is actually a very good area of further discussions where research can actually provide some evidence or at least think some thinking for the national dialogues. So it's now time to wrap up this session. I would like to thank immensely all of the experts today that join us to talk for this first research conversation on the topic of digital labor platforms. For those of you interested in digging further, the publications discussed today are available either on the AFD research paper series on AFD websites, and for the WESO 2021 report, you can find more information available on the ILO website. I am Cecilia Poggi, and this is AFD Research Conversation. Thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.